uh, um, says Aristotle. But some people are meant to be subjugated by others, are meant not to have particular rights. Now, even if someone isn't meant to have particular rights, you're not supposed to abuse them for other ethical reasons. In other words, the whole Greek ethical tradition is you're meant to have control of yourself. And one reason the Greek and the Roman tradition is so interested in the control of yourself by adult males, free adult males, who are the political actors who we're talking about, is because their power, in some sense, was absolute over children, over women, and over slaves. So much of this ethical tradition of the ancient world, which has come forward to ours, is really about tradition saying, though you can do whatever you damn well pleased, you shouldn't, as an ethical principle. But what Aristotle is saying, that's number one. What Aristotle is saying, look, some people, the relationship is between master and slave is natural. In which case, it's natural, the slaves ought to be grateful for this, the master ought to accept this, and they should be sort of friends in the sense of an inferior and a superior, the way you're friends with your dog. But where it's merely on law, which is by convention, there's all sorts of tensions, because then people say, well, let's not be slaves, let's change the law. So slaves by convention are slaves by conquest, is the most usual category. And after a while, slaves by chattel, just being bought and sold. So Aristotle now raises this question, who should get these rights? Just to be clear, who should get the, hold on just a second, who should get right? Some people naturally don't have rights, and some people naturally do have rights and ought to have rights, and we should change the legal system to make this the case. A lot of the debate that we're going to be seeing in the 19th century are going to be about saying, well, now that we make the universal claim that everyone is equal and has these rights, let's go back to nature and show why some people don't have the rights. So we get the rise of biological racism, for example. The debate you read between Sepulveda and Las Casas is a debate between two guys who are saying, one person saying, these guys are naturally slaves, they ought to be working for us in this particular kind of way, because that's how God made them. The other guy is saying, no, it's actually not true. Let's look at let's look at them. So what I'm trying to show you is that the question about who has rights has a long sort of debate, and Aristotle seems to say there's a border at nature, but where that border is pretty flexible, is movable. It's by convention, by laws, and these can be changed. So ultimately, we're going to get in this country after, well, I shouldn't say after the emancipation, but at some point after 1965, there's actually are all the laws that say that there is actually juridical equality, full stop. Okay? So who has rights is much controverted from the Magna Carta and these issues, naming particular political actors, to Aristotle saying the two categories of people, the natural slaves, the not natural slaves, and we could have many others of these distinctions. Yes? It's an ethical lapse. To be horrible to someone is to sort of lose control of yourself. I mean, in other words, if you can't govern yourself, you can't govern others. Sorry? Well, I mean, the notion, what he wants to say with the natural slave, it's that you have absolute power of this natural slave, right? And you should have natural. On the other hand, you are an ethical being who ought to live by certain sorts of rules. The most important of these rules is a certain wisdom and control of the self. We call it sophrosunoi. It's a sort of capacity to not sort of be completely out of control. I mean, in other words, the whole Greek ethical notion is grounded on the idea that you control your passions. You don't just lose it. Sorry? No, that's exactly the point. That's what being a sovereign is. But that's what saying, then you need to mediate. You need to control yourself. In other words, if you don't control yourself, you're a tyrant. But there is the legitimate exercise of absolute authority if you do it in a kindly fashion, if you do it in controlling yourself, right? So I can give you stuff to read on this. It's a really fascinating question, because how do you control people in a world in which they have absolute power? Right? I mean, that's what's happening. And one of the doctors, the notion of paternalism. Your father is supposed to be good to the kids, right? But they might not be. And if they're not be, tant pis. I mean, too bad. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like also he also mentions what's kind of tricky and weird is how like the way in which we perceive things, like in terms of like in the war, like might be unjust, but if someone like a power enslaves another power, that people are still going to perceive the person who's enslaved as a slave because the conventions that are built upon that understanding.
Right.
And then he says that, well, that's like I just don't understand how that sensation of creating that relates to like his sense of like how does that passion not articulated if it's misconstrued?
Well, the question is, these people by conquest. What he's saying in this passage and other things you read is that, look, conquered people who become slaves by conquest are actually there isn't a common interest. Because it's an accident. The reason you're enslaved and he's not is because at some point he conquered you. And if it goes on the children, it's even less reasonable. Right? So it's a kind of unjust slavery, and it yields a kind of politically fraught and violent situation. Natural slavery, he says, ought to be a thing in which there's a common union of these two. You're naturally a slave, this person's naturally a master. Right? But slavery by conquest, which is the main real version of slavery, was a real political problem. Led to rebellion, all sorts of things. Okay? So I think you get the idea. You could look at this in the Mexican context. Another sort of bearer of rights in the 1628 would be the freeborn Englishman. The freeborn Englishman is understood as a male who is a property owner and hence independent. You can't be a bearer of rights if you're dependent, which means you don't own property. You basically work for wages of someone else. You can't be independent if you're a married woman, because you're legally subsumed in your husband. You can't be independent if you're a child. So a person who can act on his own behalf, her own behalf if she's a single woman, are these freeborn people. So that's one kind of bearer of rights. So there are different sorts of bearer of rights, but there's no notion of a human bearer of rights. So what I've tried to tell you, and a great deal of human rights before human rights, or the deep history of this, is the debate about, well, what kinds of people get to carry these rights? And by the 18th century, by next time you'll see, we'll get to this idea that somehow all of these can be lumped under the category of human. And then we debate what follows from human. Okay? So I'm giving you just little spots here and there to show lots of different groups have rights for lots of different sorts of arguments. None of this goes away. All of this will feed into these universal claims that we'll be talking about in the next lecture. So written constitutions I'm going to talk to you about next time. But I just want to remind you, by written constitutions, I mean things like our Constitution, which actually set up a country based on a set of fundamental laws that are actually very difficult to change. Or the French Constitution of the year 91. And there'll be another constitution very different of the year 93. So these are constitutions in which, yes, they embody historical principles, but they're written down, they're a set of rules, they tell you how the rules can be changed, and they embody many of these rights, like habeas corpus, and freedom from having property taken, and by the time the Bill of Rights comes along, all the things that are in the Bill of Rights. Okay? So that just we have this distinction. We're going to talk the whole next lecture about these kind of constitutions. So it's okay. I'm just reminding you that there's that tradition. Okay. Well, what sorts of rights? I've already talked to you about these directed against persons. That's issues like habeas corpus, torture, are the two, and directed against property, which is taxation and having and as a representation of taking property. So those are the two sorts of rights. What's missing from all of these discussions, I just want you to notice, given what we talked about when we looked at when we graphed, is any claims for a set of positive rights. No one's claiming the right to education, right to health care, right to poor relief, any of these sort of positive social rights, which will become really important at the late 18th century on, and which we'll talk about next time. So do you get all of these rights we're talking about now are what liberal theorists call so-called negative liberties, freedom from. The positive liberty, if such a positive liberty, is to live under the rule of law, which is what guarantees these negative rights. So just remember, we're not there yet where all these things that we're claiming as rights now that are on our board are being articulated. And we'll see when that starts. It's starting, I'll tell you exactly when it starts. It starts 1793. And we'll talk about it next time. And it becomes really important, obviously, in our century. Okay. Well, I'm now going to go back to just a little, very briefly, what I talked to you about, what's the basis in political theory and theology and law for this. And this is kind of just to repeat my answer to the question you asked before. The case of no restraint is basically in Roman imperial law. And the main doctrine of Roman law is the king does not have an equal. So the sovereign is above everything. The Latin phrase, rex non parem habet, the king does not have an equal. And the other one that's still, our colleague John Yoo talks about this when he talks about the imperial presidency. You've heard this phrase? By imperial presidency, we mean a presidency which claims some version of these rules under some circumstances. Imperial, it is meant. The other part of this rule is the king is above the law. Princeps legibus salutis est. The prince of the law is free. Okay? Those are the doctrines in Roman law. These are the strongest versions in the Western tradition of the articulation of absolute sovereignty. Right? The contrary to this is this long tradition, something that goes back to the Gracchi, to Rome, to Greece, to the Middle Ages, of notion that's not true. The king has associates. The king has obligations to the people, and all sorts of other legal rules against it. So what is the restraint on this sort of version? Well, I've just said it's a history that I've just talked to you about, which pushes against these claims of the king being above the law. Repeatedly. So Charles I tries to be against the law. There's a rebellion. There's this contract. That doesn't actually work. There's a civil war. He gets his head chopped off. You know, there's a lot of water under the bridge in what I call history.